It started on an ordinary Thursday morning, one of those quiet, too perfect days in Maplewood Estates where the lawns looked cloned and even the mailboxes stood at identical angles. The kind of place where peace came with a monthly fee, and the illusion of harmony was enforced by a group of clipboard-wielding residents who called themselves the HOA board. For the most part, Maplewood was a comfortable suburb. The community pool sparkled all year round, the clubhouse smelled faintly of chlorine and sunscreen, and summer weekends meant children's laughter echoing off polished tiles. But beneath that polished surface, tension always brewed, the kind that came from living under rules written by people who enjoyed having control. When Ryan moved in 5 years ago, he hadn't thought much about the HOA. He paid his dues, kept his yard neat, and followed the endless list of guidelines taped to the community bulletin board. But over time, he noticed something: the rules seemed to multiply. The HOA wasn't managing the community, it was micromanaging it. Still, Ryan tolerated it, until the morning he opened an email titled, "Updated Amenity Access Policy, effective immediately." At first, it looked harmless. Just another one of those small administrative updates that came every few months. But as he scrolled, his expression darkened. The HOA had introduced a brand new pool access fee. Every household, even those who had already paid full annual dues, now had to pay an additional monthly fee to use the community pool, the same pool that had already been built and maintained with their money. It wasn't the amount that stung, it was the principle. The HOA had decided, overnight, without a vote or prior notice, that the amenities they all collectively owned were now premium facilities. Access would cost extra. Within hours, the community group chat was on fire. Residents complained, threatened to attend the next meeting, and even accused the board of pocketing money. But the HOA had a simple response: all fees are in accordance with Section 14 of the revised Community Charter. The fine print was their shield. Ryan read the charter, and something clicked in his mind. Section 14 mentioned reasonable adjustments to maintain operational integrity. Nowhere did it grant the board power to charge for access to shared amenities without member approval. It was a loophole, one they exploited because most residents wouldn't bother to check, but Ryan wasn't most residents. He worked as a mid-level analyst for a commercial development firm, the kind of person who spent his days reading contracts, zoning laws, and terms buried so deep even lawyers missed them. So when he saw the HOA's vague justification, he saw more than a problem, he saw an opportunity. That night, instead of venting online, Ryan opened his laptop and began digging. He downloaded the HOA's charter, the deed restrictions, and the county's public filings. He cross-referenced every clause related to shared amenities, community facilities, and usage rights. Hours turned into midnight, and by the time the clock struck 2, he found exactly what he needed, a clause buried deep in the original development contract that stated that ownership and maintenance of all community amenities shall remain collectively vested in the Homeowners Association and its registered members, with equal access rights granted by deed. That one line changed everything. The HOA didn't own the pool. The residents did. Every homeowner technically held a shared ownership stake. The board was merely a manager, not a landlord. Which meant they couldn't legally charge rent for something they didn't own. Ryan leaned back in his chair, smiling for the first time that night. If they wanted to play business, he'd treat them like one. The next day, he drafted a document titled, Amended Amenity Use Agreement, Retroactive Effective Date. It was a clever piece of writing, professional and formal, written in the same legal tone the HOA used in their notices. It stated that if the HOA wished to restrict access or charge for shared amenities, they would henceforth be considered to be leasing the property usage rights from the homeowners, with a collective interest rate of 12% per quarter on unpaid usage fees. It was a satire masked as a contract, but legally, it had teeth. Ryan printed 10 copies, signed his name at the bottom, and sent one to each board member via certified mail. He didn't post about it. He didn't make noise. He simply let the paper do its work. Days passed. Then came the silence, the eerie kind that falls when people don't know whether to laugh or panic. The HOA stopped sending pool reminders. The Facebook group grew quiet. A week later, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board. Due to administrative review, amenity fees will be temporarily suspended pending clarification. The neighbors celebrated, but Ryan knew better. The board wasn't surrendering, they were regrouping. 2 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. Mandatory attendance for all residents affected by the new amenity structure, it read. Ryan attended, sitting in the back, unnoticed at first. The board president, a polished man named Greg who wore confidence like a suit, stood at the front, addressing the crowd. He talked about necessary operating costs, about unforeseen maintenance expenses, about how the pool's upkeep had become unsustainable without additional funding. But his tone was defensive, and his words stumbled. When residents asked pointed questions, his answers grew vague. Then someone mentioned the contract. Greg froze. His eyes darted toward Ryan. A hush swept through the room as whispers rippled across the audience. People wanted to know, was it true? Had the HOA received a legal document claiming ownership interest on the amenities they were charging for? Greg tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But Ryan's neighbors, now emboldened, demanded transparency. Someone shouted that the HOA should release financial records. Another yelled that the board was acting without consent. The meeting descended into chaos. The board adjourned abruptly, promising to consult legal counsel. That night, Ryan sat on his porch, listening to the faint hum of sprinklers. He had expected pushback, maybe even a formal letter. What he didn't expect was what arrived the next morning, a thick envelope, stamped, confidential, and hand-delivered by a courier. Inside was a cease and desist notice. The HOA accused him of interfering with administrative governance and demanded he withdraw his fraudulent legal document. Ryan smiled as he read it. Because what the board didn't realize yet was that by acknowledging the document in writing, they had already recognized it existed in an official capacity, and once something existed on paper, he knew exactly how to make it matter. He opened his laptop again, and the cursor blinked on an empty page. At the top, he typed 5 words, revised contract, legal enforcement draft. Then he began to write again. The following week brought a strange quiet over Maplewood Estates, a kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but tense. The HOA board had vanished from the public eye. The usual flood of community updates, reminders, and passive-aggressive notices had stopped altogether. The bulletin board outside the clubhouse, once plastered with warnings and announcements, now stood empty except for a single yellowing poster about pool safety. But beneath that silence, the tension brewed like a storm waiting to break. Ryan knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA retaliated. He'd spent enough years reading business contracts to know how power structures behaved when threatened. They wouldn't apologize. They wouldn't admit fault. They'd find a way to reclaim control, quietly, strategically, and under the illusion of policy compliance. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, a formal letter appeared in every resident's mailbox. It was written in the HOA's trademark bureaucratic tone, long paragraphs, small print, heavy on legal jargon. The board had announced a temporary adjustment to community dues, citing maintenance fund realignment. In short, they were disguising the same pool access fee under a new name. This time, they had learned from the backlash. The new charge was buried within a paragraph about emergency capital improvements. Most residents, overwhelmed by the dense language, wouldn't even realize they were paying for the same thing twice, but Ryan noticed instantly, and he wasn't alone. A few of his neighbors had started coming to him for advice since the contract incident. What began as casual questions about HOA bylaws soon turned into strategy meetings in Ryan's garage. Every evening, a small group gathered, 6 homeowners who were tired of being manipulated by a board that operated like a private company. They called themselves the deed holders. It was a quiet joke at first, a nod to the line Ryan had found in the original community contract. But the name stuck, because it reminded them of something the board had forgotten. The homeowners actually owned this place. Together, they reviewed the HOA's financial reports, which were required by law to be publicly accessible. And what they found made their blood boil. Over the last 3 years, the HOA had been funneling money from general maintenance funds into administrative overhead, a vague expense category that had ballooned by nearly 40%. Hidden within those numbers were charges for things like consulting fees, executive travel reimbursements, and board training retreats. Ryan didn't need to guess where that money had gone. He compiled the findings into a neat packet and sent it to every homeowner, titled simply, "Where Your Fees Really Go." It wasn't an accusation, just data. Clean, undeniable data. The effect was explosive. Within hours, the community Facebook group turned into a war zone. Neighbors demanded an explanation. Some board members tried to downplay it, claiming the numbers were taken out of context. But screenshots of invoices soon started circulating, invoices with names, dates, and even signatures. By evening, the HOA could no longer pretend nothing had happened. The board president, Greg, called for another emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't just routine, it was survival. The meeting was packed. People filled the chairs, lined the walls, even stood outside the open doors to listen. The board sat at their long table, 5 people who suddenly looked much less confident than usual. Greg cleared his throat and began to speak, but his usual charm had vanished. His tone was brittle, defensive. He claimed the administrative expenses were legitimate, costs associated with maintaining compliance and ensuring community growth. But every justification only made things worse. The residents weren't angry about money anymore. They were angry about betrayal. Ryan stayed silent for most of the meeting. He didn't raise his voice or argue. He simply waited until the shouting subsided, then stood and handed Greg a folder. Inside was the revised contract, legal enforcement draft. It wasn't a joke this time. It was formatted as a binding agreement, professional, airtight, and backed by community signatures from over half the homeowners. The document declared that any attempt to impose unapproved fees or alter access to shared amenities would constitute a breach of fiduciary duty under the HOA's charter, triggering automatic compensation to the homeowners at an interest rate of 12% per quarter, payable from the board's administrative budget. The contract wasn't symbolic anymore, it was enforceable, Ryan explained, calmly and methodically, that the document would take effect immediately if the board failed to rescind the new amenity adjustment within 7 days. If they didn't comply, the community had the legal standing to file for a temporary injunction against the board's financial activities, effectively freezing their control over the HOA's funds. He didn't threaten them. He didn't have to. The logic spoke for itself. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, visibly sweating, whispered something to Greg. Another tapped nervously at her tablet, scrolling through what looked like HOA statutes. The tension in the room was so thick you could feel it. Finally, Greg leaned forward, his voice trembling slightly as he said the only thing he could, "We'll need to review this with our attorney." Ryan nodded. "You should." Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of murmuring voices and pale faces. The next few days were unlike anything Maplewood had ever seen. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Some residents feared the HOA would retaliate. Others celebrated Ryan as a hero. People who had never spoken before now exchanged knowing glances across driveways. For once, the balance of power had shifted, even if only slightly, behind the scenes. However, the board was scrambling. They contacted their legal counsel, but the lawyer's response wasn't what they'd hoped for. The contract, while unconventional, wasn't baseless. The homeowners had signed it, and it referenced real clauses from the HOA's charter. If the board ignored it, they could face a legitimate lawsuit, one they were likely to lose. The lawyer advised negotiation. Quietly. Discreetly. Before things escalated, and so, 1 week later, a letter appeared in Ryan's mailbox, this time handwritten, not printed. It was from Greg himself, requesting a private meeting to discuss potential compromise. Ryan didn't respond immediately. He let the request sit on his kitchen counter for a full day before finally agreeing. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he understood something crucial. The HOA didn't fear legal threats. They feared losing control. When the meeting finally took place, it wasn't in the community hall. It was at Greg's own house, a sprawling corner property with a manicured garden that, ironically, violated at least 2 of the HOA's landscaping rules. The conversation that followed would set the stage for everything that came next: the negotiations, the exposure, and the final collapse of Maplewood's iron-fisted HOA system. But before any of that could happen, one thing had to be decided. Would Ryan accept their offer to work together, or would he take the entire board down with their own rules? The meeting at Greg's house took place on a gray afternoon, the kind where even the sunlight seemed hesitant to appear. The air was heavy, humid, tense. The house itself looked as meticulously curated as ever, with trimmed hedges and a driveway so spotless it seemed polished. But inside, the atmosphere was different. Stale. Nervous. The kind of quiet that fills a room when people realize they've lost the upper hand. Greg greeted Ryan with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The other 4 board members were already seated around a long oak table, papers spread out like battle plans. For once, there were no refreshments, no polite introductions, no posturing. Just business, and fear hiding behind professionalism. Ryan sat across from them and placed a folder on the table. The board members eyed it cautiously, as if it might explode. It didn't contain threats or lawsuits, only copies of the homeowners' signed petitions, neatly organized, and a breakdown of financial inconsistencies compiled from the HOA's own records. Greg began to speak, choosing his words carefully. He admitted that certain administrative practices may have been in need of revision. He called the new amenity fee a misstep, and described the outrage as a communication breakdown. His tone tried to sound reasonable, even humble, but Ryan could hear the cracks. This wasn't humility, it was damage control. The board wanted a truce. They proposed reversing the fee, issuing a partial refund, and forming a homeowner advisory group to oversee future decisions. It was a move designed to calm the neighborhood without surrendering power completely, but Ryan knew better. These were the same people who had buried financial details, changed policies in secret, and treated residents like tenants instead of owners. Giving them another chance to self-regulate would just start the cycle over again. He thanked them for the offer, then opened the folder. Inside was a new document, a proposal for full financial transparency and an independent audit of the HOA's accounts, to be funded by the board's administrative budget. It also included a clause that required a full community vote before any future rule or fee change could take effect. Greg's expression hardened as he read it. It was polite, lawful, and devastating. If the board accepted it, they would effectively strip themselves of the unchecked authority they'd built over years. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow ticking of the wall clock, each second carving away their confidence. Finally, one of the board members, a woman who had remained silent through most of the meeting, broke the stillness. She said softly that she agreed with Ryan's proposal. The others turned to stare at her, shocked, but she didn't flinch. She reminded them that they were supposed to represent the community, not rule over it. That what had started as a few administrative adjustments had become something ugly, something people were afraid of. Her words hit harder than Ryan's documents ever could. The silence that followed was heavy and final. Within minutes, 2 other board members reluctantly agreed to sign. Greg and his closest ally refused, but it didn't matter anymore. A majority vote was enough. Ryan left the meeting without gloating, without a smile. He didn't need to. The balance of power had shifted completely, and he knew it wouldn't swing back. The next few weeks changed everything in Maplewood Estates. A community-wide meeting was held, the largest in the neighborhood's history. Ryan presented the findings, the signed agreement, and the new homeowner protections. The mood was electric, a mix of disbelief, pride, and relief. People who had once stayed silent were now speaking up. They asked questions, demanded accountability, and finally saw the HOA for what it truly was, a group of neighbors, not overlords. The audit revealed more than anyone expected. Thousands of dollars had been misallocated, not stolen, but spent on unnecessary executive perks and board-exclusive amenities. The revelation hit the community like a shockwave. For the first time, people realized how much control they had lost by trusting blindly. By the end of that month, Greg resigned. His ally followed soon after. The remaining board members dissolved the old system and scheduled an open election for a new, community-run committee. Ryan was nominated to lead it, but he declined. He didn't want to become another version of what he'd fought against. Instead, he offered to help design the new structure, one that prevented power from concentrating in a few hands ever again. The new committee was smaller, transparent, and bound by quarterly homeowner votes. Every expense over $1,000 had to be logged publicly. Every rule change required approval. For the first time, the neighborhood's rules were written by the people living under them, and as for the infamous 12% interest contract, it became a running joke, framed and hung on the wall inside the clubhouse as a reminder of what happens when people stop asking questions. Months passed, and life in Maplewood slowly returned to normal. The lawns were still perfect, the pool still shimmered in the afternoon light, but something intangible had changed. There was laughter where tension used to be. Neighbors waved without suspicion. The place finally felt like a community again, not a corporation disguised as one. Ryan still walked by the pool some evenings, watching the lights ripple across the water. It was quiet, peaceful. But he remembered how easily that piece had been sold, and how hard it had been to reclaim that. He often thought about that night he first read the email, the anger that drove him to open his laptop, and the line in the original deed that started it all, equal ownership and access by right of residence. Those words had always been there, buried, ignored, forgotten. All it took was someone willing to read them, to understand that rules only work when they're fair, and authority only lasts when people consent to it. And in that small suburban neighborhood, built on order and control, one man had reminded everyone that power doesn't come from paperwork, it comes from people. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on, Ryan turned back toward home. The air smelled faintly of chlorine and grass, the same as always, but Maplewood Estates would never be the same again.